From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
How goes Israel's war in Gaza? President Biden is eager for that war to end, and he has pitched a new peace plan. But Hamas, the terror group, has so far failed to accept it. Meanwhile, Israel's northern border erupts in new skirmishes as Iran's proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah, continues to shell Israeli villages. And the United Nations Atomic Energy Agency censures Iran for failing to cooperate on inspecting its nuclear sites and barring experienced UN inspectors. Will President Biden be able to calm the Middle East down between now and America's election day in November? Welcome to today's Potomac Watch podcast. I'm Paul Gigot, editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here with my colleagues Joe Sternberg and Elliot Kaufman, both of whom have been following events in the Middle East. Let's start with the Biden peace plan, which was unveiled late last week by the president at the White House, and let's listen to him talk about it.
The people of Israel should know they can make this offer without any further risk to their own security because they've devastated Hamas forces over the past 8 months. At this point, Hamas no longer is capable of carrying out another October 7th, which is one of the Israelis' main objectives in this war, and quite frankly, a righteous one. I know there are those in Israel who will not agree with this plan and will call for the war to continue indefinitely. Some are even in the government coalition. And they've made it clear they want to occupy Gaza, they want to keep fighting for years, and the hostages are not a priority to them. Well, I've urged the leadership in Israel to stand behind this deal, despite whatever pressure comes.
Well, there you are, Elliot. So let's start out by setting the stage. Where does this peace plan stand now in terms of both Israeli and Hamas acceptance?
So the big question was, whose plan was it in the first place? President Biden presented it as Israel's plan. Now, it was strange. Why was he announcing it then rather than Israel announcing it? And I think we now have some more answers to those questions. It was an Israeli plan. So Israel put a deal forward to get hostages back, a ceasefire for Hamas in exchange, Hamas terrorists, many of them to be released. Israel's war cabinet approved this plan. And yet, for precisely the reasons that President Biden was mentioning, that there are further right people in Israel's cabinet who wouldn't like this sort of deal, the Israeli war cabinet had wanted to keep it quiet, nix some of that opposition before they even knew if Hamas would say yes or no to the plan. By announcing it publicly, President Biden sort of put an end to that, and Israelis have ever since been tearing at each other over this deal. A hypothetical. What's Hamas saying? Most of the signs we have so far are that Hamas isn't going to take the deal, just as many Israelis had thought. Hamas hasn't given its official answer yet. Probably it'll want to keep talking and drag things out and push for more concessions. In other words, the same thing it has done for months and months on end.
But just to clarify, the Israeli war cabinet has not repudiated the deal.
You're right. It hasn't. It stood by this deal, and the ball is in Hamas's court. If it wants a deal like this, it can have it.
Meanwhile, there have been protests inside Israel against the idea of signing on to this deal, particularly from the forces on the right inside the Prime Minister Netanyahu coalition.
That's right. And the key question is, would the deal end the war entirely? Because if it does, and if it results in a full Israeli withdrawal, Hamas will retake Gaza. Hamas will be in control of Gaza. And while President Biden says that it has been damaged so it can't do in October 7th again, well, that's right now. What about a year from now, after Hamas rebuilds with all of the international reconstruction money that would come in? Israelis know that would be a real danger.
Joe, that strikes me as a crucial point. And I say that because the president's language in the remarks we heard was, well, curious. He said Israelis don't need to worry anymore because Hamas has been devastated and at this point, quote unquote, would not have the capacity to do another October 7th. Awful lot of things being carried by that phrase at this point, because if Hamas survives in Rafah and elsewhere, it will have the potential to reconstitute itself over time. And in fact, the president's other point, which he made, which I think is questionable, is he said that the progress Israel has made so far in devastating Hamas, it was part of its war aims. Well, actually, Israel's war aim is the same as the American war aim against ISIS. It was to destroy Hamas.
Exactly. I think that the real problem with all of this discussion is that it creates this impression that there are a lot of negotiations going on, except with the people who are actually responsible for this situation, which is Hamas. I mean, as Elliot has pointed out, there's no particular sign that they would be open right now to any kind of deal that would be acceptable to Israel, which, let us remember, is a democracy. So you do have to secure buy-in from the public and various political actors for any kind of deal of this sort. And Hamas are the ones who started this situation with their invasion of Israel on October 7th. And yet now we seem to be trapped in this situation where we will have negotiations between everyone who's involved in the situation except for the people who are responsible for it. And I think that that creates real problems because that makes it much harder to reassure people in Israel that the U.S. is trying to be a broker here that is keeping their interests in mind and is alert to the fact that they do have this overwhelming security problem that they are going to have to deal with. And that the only way right now that they can be confident that they will have solved that problem is by destroying Hamas as a terrorist organization, capable of perpetrating that sort of attack again. And that gets completely lost. And making matters worse, I mean, the other thing that jumped out at me from the clip we heard from President Biden is this notion that somehow it's the Israelis who want to continue this, situation, this war any longer than they absolutely have to. They don't want the war, but they do want security.
Well, that's right. I don't think Israelis want endless war, at least nobody in Israel that I know, though there are Israelis who would like to occupy Gaza and not give it back to the Palestinians, as they did in 2005. So how, Elliot, is the Israeli campaign going in the city of Rafah? It seems to be moving ahead. They've cleared the border area between Egypt and Rafah, cutting off the infiltration routes there and the aid routes that have supplied arms and whatnot to Hamas. But it's still not destroyed, and it's a very tough operation given the tunnel network and the close quarters.
The first success of the Rafah campaign was to clear out the civilian population. This was something the U.S. said that Israel couldn't do. It didn't have a plan for it. It could never do it. It was impossible. It did it. That was number one. Number two was taking the Gaza's border with Egypt. This is a major strategic achievement because, as you say, it stops the smuggling. Just a few days ago, Israel blew up a 2-kilometer tunnel in the area going right to the Egyptian border. With that done, Hamas can't bring in more weapons, more supplies. It's now starting to be choked off, which actually raises the question of why Israel didn't do this a long time ago. Of course, President Biden was urging them not to. Egypt was urging them not to. Well, Egypt must have known about some of these tunnels. It will have some very difficult questions to answer. Going forward, the Israelis have taken more than 25% of the city of Rafah, it appears, and they are pushing north from Egypt's border, and they have succeeded in splitting western Rafah from eastern Rafah. So the estimates now are that it will take the rest of the month to finish in the city. If they could use more troops, they could move faster, but there's been U.S. pressure to use fewer troops, so it's going to go on at a decent pace, but not as fast as it could.
All right, we're going to take a break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about the impact of the war's progress and the pressure from President Biden on Israel and elsewhere in the Middle East when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal on our Potomac Watch podcast, and I'm here with Elliot Kaufman and Joe Sternberg. Let's talk about the president's ceasefire proposal in a larger political context, Joe. And I think the president really does want this war over, and of course he wants it over for its own sake. Nobody wants to see this war continue, but he has a particular aim. One is he wants the war to end because it really is a prerequisite to getting the deal he wants to conclude between Saudi Arabia and Israel. It's essentially a security pact. The Saudis would get U.S. security guarantees and the ability to enrich uranium and keep the enriched uranium. And in return, Saudi Arabia would recognize Israel, and you would have a condominium between the two countries that would be a significant diplomatic move forward, particularly in tightening a coalition in opposition to Iran. And the other reason the president wants it, he wants the world to calm down between now and Election Day. The narrative exists with cause that the world is on fire, Joe, and Ukraine and the Middle East, and threats rising elsewhere. And that's playing into Donald Trump's hands.
Yeah, and let's not forget just at the start why this is so acutely embarrassing for President Biden. It's because after all of his years doing foreign policy in the Senate, this is supposed to be the thing he was good at. So I think that there is a particular sense of embarrassment over the fact that all of these problems have erupted on his watch when this was supposed to be his special skill set. And, unfortunately, presidents have to often take the world as it is rather than they would want it to be. I think part of this, though, is a problem of his own making. Particularly, you mentioned the I word, Paul, which is Iran. Hamas's sponsors, also sponsors of Hezbollah and Israel's north, harassing Israel there and trying to create an arc of influence and instability across the Middle East. And I think that one of the fundamental problems that Biden is grappling with now is that his very forgiving, conciliatory approach toward Iran has actually created the conditions for a lot of the eruptions he's struggling to manage now. And, unfortunately for him and for the region and for the U.S., even in what he considers to be his political best case, which is if he could engineer some sort of ceasefire to park this issue for now, that's not going to go away. And in fact, I think the danger is that the wrong kind of ceasefire at this moment increases the likelihood that we experience more instability in the region down the road.
There is also the impact on Israeli politics of the president's ceasefire offer and pressure on Israel, Elliot. And one of the ironies here is that it seems to be helping Prime Minister Netanyahu's political standing, particularly when Netanyahu is seen by Israelis as standing up to the president of the United States over whether or not to create a Palestinian state after the fighting has ended. So Biden wants Bibi gone. It's very clear. He wants to deal with a different prime minister. And remember when Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, explicitly said he wants Bibi gone. Yet he is enhancing the political standing with his policy, Biden is, of Netanyahu. And it seems to me to be clear that the fastest way, if you want Bibi gone from Israel's leadership, the fastest way to do it is let him win the war. And then the Israelis would be able to be more confident and have less concern about Hamas, and then could have what I think they're going to have eventually, which is a real reckoning over October 7th.
Right. They could say, thank you very much, Mr. Netanyahu, and now somebody else, please. I think that President Biden has made it very clear he's trying to undermine Prime Minister Netanyahu. He does it all the time in countless ways, statements, policies. The latest was saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu is dragging out the war for his own political purposes, but there have been intelligence releases of various unflattering things, all sorts of things, because it's probably good politics for President Biden in America. The problem is that undermining Netanyahu is good politics for Netanyahu in Israel. So there's this mutually reinforcing sort of action taking place here. I mean, Israel is one of the most pro-American countries in the world. However, when they see it that the thrust of American policy right now is to grant Hamas a victory in Gaza, a lasting victory. You know, they'll call it some sort of power sharing agreement in Gaza, but Hamas would be the power there. Having a fight with that sort of American president is actually pretty good for the Israeli prime minister. And the question Israelis ask is, would the opposition leaders stand up to an American president in the same way? And they don't know the answer because there's only one prime minister right now.